Our kingdom go is the necessary and unavoidable corollary of thy kingdom come. For the more there is of self, the less there is of God. The divine eternal fullness of life can be gained only by those who have deliberately lost the partial separative life of craving and self-interest, of egocentric thinking, feeling, wishing, and acting. Mortification on deliberate dying to self is inculcated with an uncompromising firmness into the canonical writings of Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and most of the other major and minor religions of the world, and by every theocentric saint and spiritual reformer who has ever lived out and expounded the principles of the Perennial Philosophy. But this self-nodding is never, at least by anyone who knows what he is talking about, regarded as an end in itself. It possesses merely an instrumental value, as the indispensable means to something else. In the words of one whom we have often had occasion to cite in earlier sections, it is necessary for all of us to learn the true nature and worth of all self-denials and mortifications. Huxley reflects on how sages would use fasting, or even torturing themselves to have an experience with the divine. He quotes William Law, who states that there's a danger for using self-denial for enlightenment. When one is practicing self-denial, they can be self-righteous over those who are self-indulgent. But however, in this righteousness, ironically, it becomes a form of indulgence. Quote, that the mortified are, in some respects, often much worse than the unmortified is commonplace in history, fiction, and descriptive psychology. Thus, the Puritan may practice all the cardinal virtues, prudence, fortitude, temperance, and chastity, and yet remain a thoroughly bad man. For in all too many cases, these virtues of his are accompanied by, and indeed causally connected with, the sins of pride, envy, chronic anger, and an uncharitableness pushed sometimes to the level of active cruelty. Mistaking the means for the end, the Puritan has fancied himself holy because he is stoically austere. But stoical austerity is merely the exaltation of the more credible side of the ego at the expense of the less credible. Holiness, on the contrary, is the total denial of the separate self, in its credible no less than its discreditable aspects, and the abandonment of the will to God. To the extent that there is attachment to I, me, mine, there is no attachment to, and therefore no unitive knowledge of, the divine ground. Mortification has to be carried to the pitch of non-attachment, or otherwise it merely transfers self-will from one channel to another, not merely without decrease in the total volume of that self-will, but sometimes with an actual increase. As usual, the corruption of the best is the worst. To sum up, that mortification is the best which results in the elimination of self-will, self-interest, self-centered thinking, wishing, and imagining. Extreme physical austerities are not likely to achieve this kind of mortification, but the acceptance of what happens to us, apart of course from our own sins, in the course of daily living is likely to produce this result. If specific exercises are undertaken, they should be inconspicuous, non-competitive, and non-injurious to health. Huxley argues that it's not necessary to add additional suffering upon ourselves, but that when we exist in this material form, some degree of suffering inevitably occurs. So when this happens and reality doesn't go our way, that is a test of our awareness and reverence for existence, which is something I could work on and use a little bit of improvement personally. Huxley also examines right livelihood as an embodiment of spiritual practice. And this is an honest thing to ask ourselves. What impact do our decisions have on others? Do these decisions perpetuate suffering? Are they from a place of service? Is the institution we're working for is making a decent living only to find out that it causes suffering? Huxley also emphasizes that while right livelihood does have a few parameters, you don't want to work for the mafia, for instance, it's not really about dogma. Don't do this, don't do that, as is more common with the desert religions. But how do our decisions affect others, and what might these effects have karmically, ethically, environmentally, or otherwise? And actually, a relative of mine had an ambition of becoming a stockbroker, but he decided that gouging the elderly out of their pensions wasn't for him. But in the case of, say, a Jordan Belfort or a Bernie Madoff, they followed the path of complete self-interest and went to prison for their unethical decisions. Quote, "It has been found as a matter of experience that it is dangerous to lay down detailed and inflexible rules for right livelihood is dangerous because most people see no reason for being righteous, overmuch, and consequently respond to the imposition of too rigid a code by hypocrisy or open rebellion." This reminds me of kind of a right-wing talking point that I heard years back when this documentary Before the Flood came out. Something like, well, all those celebrities who talk about climate change themselves fly around in private jets and contribute to the pollution that they're raising awareness of. And that is exactly the problem we face, and it shows the complexity of the situation.
And here's another thing that you people talk about. All these peace movement, all these demonstrators, they'll run out and demonstrate for a nuclear power plant and go home and turn electricity on. If you want to demonstrate for a nuclear power plant, don't use electricity. Does it make sense? You know what I'm saying? They want to demonstrate for something on one hand and get their faces up in the camera and like, look at me, I'm different, you know, or pay me to be somebody, you dig? And then on the other hand, they can't be somebody because they go home and turn the fucking electricity on and use the same fucking pollution. You dig what I'm saying? In other words, you can't protest cutting down trees with paperwork.
It's a fact that our lifestyle in the West in its current form has a cost to the environment. And that could change with alternatives such as solar, which would allow us to produce our own energy instead of bombing the shit out of people in the Middle East and doing business with the Saudis. But as a reminder of what Huxley was referring to earlier, it can be easy to get self-righteous and become a social justice warrior about this.
How dare you!
And at the end, I'm actually going to give you an exercise that reveals how all of us play a role in the system as it currently exists. So this is something to meditate upon. How are we supporting ourselves and what impact does this have? Am I acting in such a way that is beneficial not only for my survival, but the survival of mankind? And where's the accountability? Is the CEO of an oil company any more accountable than the employees and all of the people who use fossil fuels in order to get to work? It's quite a mess. Everything is entangled and interconnected. We can protest against the 1% all we want, but deep down we know that in all of us there's the same unquenchable thirst for power in the quote-unquote greedy businessman. Quote, "Of all social, moral, and spiritual problems, that of power is the most chronically urgent and the most difficult of solution. Craving for power is not a vice of the body, consequently knows none of the limitations imposed by a tired or satiated physiology upon gluttony, intemperance, and lust. Growing with every successive satisfaction, the appetite for power can manifest itself indefinitely without interruption of bodily fatigue or sickness. Moreover, the nature of society is such that the higher a man climbs in the political, economic, or religious hierarchy, the greater are his opportunities and resources for exercising power. But climbing the hierarchical ladder is ordinarily a slow process. The older he grows, the more chances does the power lover have for indulging his besetting sin, the more continuously is he subjected to temptations, and the more glamorous do those temptations become. And his situation is profoundly different than that of the debauchee, but at least as he advances in years, he finds his vices leaving him. The former neither leaves his vices nor is left by them. Instead of bringing to the power lover a merciful respite from his addictions, old age is apt to intensify them by making it easier for him to satisfy his cravings on a larger scale in a more spectacular way. That is why, in Acton's words, all great men are bad. Can we therefore be surprised if political action undertaken, in all too many cases, not for the public good, but solely or at least primarily to gratify the power lusts of bad men, should prove so often either self-stultifying or downright disastrous? So from our perspective, yes, it's easy to condemn those bankers who exploit us so they can sip on champagne on a yacht. But does this mean that we're innocent angels? I mean, do we ourselves manipulate or exploit other people? How do you think our lifestyle exists? It doesn't come out of a vacuum. For the rest of the world's perspectives, we exploit others every time we go to Amazon and click add to cart, profiting off of labor from third world countries. And in fact, the computer I'm using to edit this was probably manufactured in China, at least a good portion of it. So from a global perspective, who are you? Are you the oppressor or are you the oppressed? And it's easy to sit on your ass pointing the finger on social media, but to really make a difference, you have to build things. Let's say hypothetically you wanted to build an ethical computer company. You'd have to build all the components from scratch or make sure they're imported in a legitimate way. You would have to pay your workers a decent wage and give them benefits. You would have to go through all the paperwork, logistics, taxes, and legal issues in case some fucking idiot tinkers with your product and electrocutes himself. And after the fucking thing is made, you would have to market it in such a way that people are actually convinced that paying a little bit extra for this ethically made product is better than the unethically made computers that are cheaper. So doing that would be extremely tedious, and it could take even a decade to implement and make a reality. But it would be an example of right livelihood and a valuable life purpose. So what does all this mean in the context of right livelihood? Do we have to all go 110% green, make Greta proud, and grow all of our food and live off tofu and chanting mantras all day? Well, that's just not a practical expectation. Good luck trying to have an enlightened civilization by the year 2030. So this is why I actually appreciate Hindu philosophy so much, because it acknowledges the brutality of reality. In the Bhagavad Gita, it is shown how life is warfare, and the nature of reality is the cosmos devouring itself. It's true, we are all interconnected within this, in this way. And within spiritual communities, you'll hear, the term, we're all interconnected, man. We're all one. It's all one consciousness. But that actually means that you're the same consciousness as the 1% you despise. You're the same consciousness as Trump or Biden or Gandhi or Epstein or terrorists or anything that exists in reality. Quote, sufficient not only unto the day, but also unto the place is the evil thereof. Agitation over happenings which we are powerless to modify, either because they have not yet occurred or else are occurring at an inaccessible distance from us, achieves nothing beyond the inoculation of here and now with the remote or anticipated evil that is the object of our distress. Listening 4 or 5 times a day to newscasters and commentators, reading the morning papers and all the weeklies and monthlies nowadays. This is described as taking an intelligent interest in politics. St. John of the Cross would have called it indulgence in idle curiosity and the cultivation of disquietude for disquietude's sake. You might notice that there's a lot of evil, downright sadistic shit in this planet. And we get upset because we have the capacity to suffer, but also the capacity to inflict suffering upon others, whether advertently or inadvertently. And people tend to externalize their shadow onto others. It is by facing, acknowledging, observing, integrating the shadow that enlightenment, or the divine ground, as Huxley describes, can be attained. This is why shadow work, as Carl Jung called it, is so critical. And this can be done during meditation, contemplation, hypnosis, or other means. I might actually do a video about it in October for Halloween. We'll see. Feel free to leave a comment or reach out to me if you'd like to see that happen. We return to the Perennial Philosophy. Quote, it is by losing the egocentric life that we save the hitherto latent and undiscovered life, which, in the spiritual part of our being, we share with the divine ground. This new formed life is more abundant than the other, and of a different and higher kind. Its possession is liberation into the eternal, and liberation is beatitude. Necessarily so, for the Brahmin, who is at one with the Atman, is not only being and knowledge, but also bliss, and after love and peace, the final fruit of the spirit is joy. Mortification is painful, but that pain is one of the preconditions of blessedness. So there's this concept in Buddhism called the Bodhisattva, who has stayed in this realm to liberate the suffering of all sentient beings, Tantric Buddhism. Whereas the path of renunciation, Hinayana Buddhism, is more about getting the fuck out of here through a more strict and ascetic way. And all of this isn't to be depressing or preachy, rather to encourage patience and to see things in the context of integration, evolution, transcendence, and ultimately liberation. And in fact, the principle of right livelihood encourages you to use your power in a practical way that has direct impact. There's so many incredible things going on in technology and business and psychology, spirituality, that you can take part of directly. And fortunately, it isn't limited to oming in a mountain in a robe. Well, that's awesome too. So here's an exercise that I have for you, just for the sake of curiosity and shits and giggles. Pick 3 items that you consume on a regular basis and research the process of how they're made. Does the product bring suffering to the user or the people who make it? Is it made of high quality materials or complete dog shit that cause it to break and constantly need repair? What's its impact on your health? What's its impact on the environment? For instance, there was a clip I saw years ago of putting nets near factories that manufacture Apple products. And these nets were placed so that way workers wouldn't commit suicide from their living conditions. Not exactly a good example of right livelihood on the part of Steve Jobs. The world is the way it is not because there's some capitalist or communist or Muslim or infidel or hippie or Trump supporter or whatever possible identity some petty human conjured up, but the ego and the lack of awareness. So to end on a more encouraging note, here is one final quote from Huxley. Quote, "The relationship between moral action and spiritual knowledge is circular, as it were, and reciprocal. Selfless behavior makes possible an accession of knowledge, and the accession of knowledge makes possible the performance of further and more genuinely selfless actions, which in turn enhance the agent's capacity for knowing." So that wraps up today's commentary on mortification, non-attachment, and right livelihood. And feel free to check out the montage that I have of the right livelihood portion of that chapter. So I invite you to share your thoughts and experiences with right livelihood in the comments down below, and any examples of developments and strategies for us to share with each other to make the world suck a little less is always a good thing. So have a fantastic week, and maybe give a snack to a homeless person if you're so inclined and would like to do some karma yoga. Peace out.